loud. I've hit the right buttons in roughly the right order. Good evening, everybody. Tony here. Trust everybody is well. And let's hope, as we've been chatting, that the weather improves, because it's just damp and miserable. Few quick announcements. We have coming up this weekend, Blanche and Bacaro Peninsula field trip, led by James Hurtle. Keep your eyes on Facebook. That may change date-wise, as it's Saturday and the weather's looking pretty average, to say the least. It might change to Sunday. I'm waiting to hear back from James. On the 20th of April, we have the Earth Fest event at Biscuit Lake, led by Laurie. Thank you very much for that. And the big news, as Richard mentioned, at the out-of-town weekend, will be in the Wolfville area over the weekend of the 8th and 9th of June. We have some amazing field trip leaders, Richard Stern, Pat Kelly, and Jake Walker. And the Sunday morning walk will be probably around Miners Marsh. It'll just be a stroll for families and anybody, and there won't really be a lead ranger, and I'll be there and we'll wander around and just see what we can find. You never know. But more details will be posted. I'm waiting to hear back on a location for the evening meeting on the Saturday night and for speakers for that night. A lot of people aren't around till April for some reason in various worlds. We are going to be staying with our trailer at Highbury campground. If anybody else would like to camp along, we'd love to see them. So that's that detail. I say full details will be coming up on the website in about a week's time, once we've got the final T's and I's dotted and crossed. We've also got coming up the City Nature Challenge, basically to do with INAT, and any details, please contact Mary Kennedy. That will be up on the website in the events section very shortly. Basically over a weekend period, let's just look at the exact dates, 26th to the 29th. It's a global event. It's 4 days. Record all your details into INAT, and then we'll see how the areas in Nova Scotia do. It looks like it's going to be at the moment just HRM and CBRM in that, but please record everything: trees, mice, not each other, but everything. Let's get some good numbers up and see how we do on that. Anyway, migration is getting closer. The hummers are moving northwards. The first few, can't call them stragglers, but early arrivals have started turning up with the odd swallow and things, which is nice to see. And we're all going to have to learn the half-remembered songs and the changing plumages on these birds, which rather brilliantly leads us to our main event tonight. We are lucky to have Shay Turner doing this evening's chat. She is a Master of Science student at Thompson Rivers University out in Kamloops and a professional biologist over in the province of BC. She specializes in avian ecology and has worked for many years on multi-species monitoring and management programs, stuff to do with Motus and bird banding, etc. So we're looking to hear all this. And we have so many warblers heading our way. We're all going to be so happy shortly, because we get a bit shat back in the winter when it's quiet. At least I certainly do. So Shay, over to you. Do your stuff. Share the screen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to be talking about warblers, so perfect time to get ready for their arrival. And I'm just on a laptop here. So once I start sharing my screen, I won't be able to see you anymore. But if you want to ask a question while I'm still going through this, feel free to. You'll just have to put your mic on and you can interrupt me. I just won't be able to see you. But I will leave enough time so that you can ask questions at the end and we can have a bit of a discussion. So I am talking to you today about part of my Masters of Science research that I'm doing here in British Columbia. And this project is a collaborative project between Thompson Rivers University and a couple of institutions in the US. So Georgetown out of Washington, DC, and the Ohio State University out of Columbus, Ohio. And then we also have some collaboration in Jamaica with some local researchers there. And so I'll be talking about molt and what's happening on the wintering grounds there, and then migration. And I'll give you the punchline right away. I tracked these birds, some of my study population, to Nova Scotia. So I'm super excited to talk to you guys because these birds actually went to Nova Scotia and are likely breeding there or nearby. So I'll give you a bit of background on me. I grew up on the West Coast near Vancouver and have done quite a bit of work in BC, mostly on the coast, but also in the Peath region, so northeast BC on the other side of the Rockies, where we see a lot of these eastern warblers that are familiar to you, redstarts and black and white warblers, ovenbirds, lots of those guys. And I've been involved with bird banding and migration monitoring since 2015 and worked on some projects in BC, but also in Southern Ontario and some other parts of the world. So I'll show you one of my favorite Western warblers, the black-throated gray warbler. We catch quite a few of these around Vancouver. And this is the nest of a black and white warbler. This is one of my first experiences working with this species, which will be a feature in this presentation. I worked on a nest monitoring and nest productivity study in Fort St. John in the Peace. I did some work in Paraguay looking at molt in subtropical residents in 2018. This is a red-crested cardinal in active molt there. We'll be talking a lot about molt today. And after that, did some banding in Ontario and got to see a lot of these beautiful eastern birds, black Bernian warblers, chestnut-sided warblers, a lot of birds that I don't typically get to see in BC that you are all familiar with. And now for my master's research, I'm studying warblers in Jamaica, as I said, and this is a northern water thrush. That photo taken last winter in 2023 when I was in Jamaica. Unfortunately, I didn't go again this winter. Some other people are continuing that field work, but I am stuck in BC now, tied to my computer working on my data analysis. So just give you a bit of context. I'm based in Kamloops, interior BC, and this is Secwepemc, the traditional and unceded territory of the Kamloops to Secwepemc people. But we completed this fieldwork in Jamaica, which is the stolen colonized lands of the Maitaino people, the first indigenous peoples of Jamaica, as we now call it. And there is really not much of an indigenous presence in Jamaica anymore because of that colonization. But the reason I bring this up is that I'm working in an academic institution which has had this long, complicated history with colonization, and just bringing attention to the fact that, you know, how we conduct science in the Western world, Western science. This colonial history does really influence how I've been trained to do science, and this is really just one way of understanding the environment that we typically use in Westernized countries, but there are other ways of understanding the environment as well. And it's not the focus of my presentation, but if you're interested in that topic, there have been a couple of really interesting works that have been published recently about neotropical ornithology, so the study of birds that's happening in the tropics, in places like Jamaica and the Caribbean, but also in Central and South America, that talk about some of these systemic barriers where a lot of the work that's been done there has been driven by institutions in Canada and the US, often with more funding for research. And there is now, in the last few years, especially maybe the last 5 years, a big push to transition to more locally led work and have those local voices be at the forefront of the science that's being done. And Birds Caribbean is a nonprofit that is really kind of leading the charge on that, building capacity for birding tours and also, you know, bird banding and bird monitoring. So if you're unfamiliar with Birds Caribbean. That is a really interesting place to look up potential birding trips, because they just did some trips to Cuba this year that sounded really interesting. So, and this presentation is going to go exactly how you would think it is. I'm going to walk you through my research, but what's important to highlight here is that these are my preliminary results. I'm not quite finished, so I don't have the full picture for this work, but I am hopefully finishing this summer. And so I'm working towards getting the whole story of what's going on with this study population. And I will just take you through sort of what I know so far. So some of you might have seen this figure before. This is from Cornell University, and from using a lot of citizen science data and other data sources, we know that we have lost at least 2.9 billion birds from breeding populations of birds that breed in Canada and the United States. And this could very well be an underestimate. We may have lost more birds than this since 1970. So this is really an astounding number. And within this includes our migratory birds, migratory songbirds that travel to spend our winters. Oh, yep. Did someone have a question? Maybe not. Okay. Yeah, including migratory birds that spend our winters in the tropics, tropical Caribbean, and Central and South America. And in this presentation, I'm going to tie this into molt and kind of show you how molt fits into the lives of these birds and why molt is important for understanding population declines in birds, but specifically in songbirds and warblers in my work. Yeah, so that includes species like the American redstart. So when we're looking at the annual cycle of these migratory birds and warblers specifically, a lot of their life is revolving around finding food, and finding food requires energy, and around breeding, finding mates, finding breeding territories, and investing a lot of energy into breeding. So both of these events require a lot of energy, and also maintaining their feathers. We know feathers are obviously very important for flight, but they're also important for thermoregulation and managing parasites that can be on birds' feathers and damaging birds' feathers. And also important for social communication. Tony was just talking about how birds are changing their plumage when they're arriving here from spring sometimes, and getting used to those differences in plumage from the fall when a lot of birds are more drab, and in spring when birds are often more colorful and fancier for the breeding season. And then in winter, when these birds are breeding up here in our cold winters, they're starting to think about their nice beach vacations because they can't find the insects that they need to maintain their life, essentially. So these insectivores are heading down to the tropics to find food and have a reliable food source that they have throughout the winter until they can come back up here for the breeding season. So a lot of this is centering around energy and finding energy. So in our year, we have breeding, migration, and molt. And I'll talk a little bit more about the particular molts that are happening in birds' lives, but essentially we have molt in songbirds that's generally happening after the breeding season on the breeding grounds. And then sometimes we have more molt that's happening on the overwintering grounds before birds are coming back up to breed. And I'll get into that a little bit more, but molt being that process of replacing feathers for birds to maintain their feather function. And then just a note on terminology, we're kind of working towards, especially in the study of birds that use tropical habitats, of improving the terms that we use. I'm kind of referring to the bird's overwintering period, but I just want to bring it to our attention that it's not really winter in Jamaica and the Caribbean, even though it's in the same hemisphere as us. They're not having that same change in seasons. It's really more of a 2-season system. So they have the dry season and the wet season, and the dry season kind of being from around October to maybe end of March. So they're really seeing a 2-season change, and they're not really calling it winter there. So we can also think of this as the non-breeding period, when birds are not breeding, happening during our winter. So molt is that process of feather replacement. We have our red-crested cardinal here that's molting its flight feathers. So some groups of birds, like water birds, they will sometimes molt a lot of their wing feathers at one time to a point where they're not able to fly very well during that time. But in songbirds, they're typically doing it in sequence, so one or a few feathers at a time, so that they can still fly during this time. And I apologize if there might be some molt experts on this call. This might be a bit of review for you, but for those of you who aren't, I hope you're learning something new here. So birds are also changing over their head and body feathers. This is a black and white warbler that I caught in Jamaica, and you can see these kind of ugly little pin feathers here. I think you can see my cursor, so you can see what I'm pointing at. And then on the right, we have a black-headed grosbeak, and you can see here we have this block of black feathers, and these are feathers that have been replaced more recently than these kind of older, a little bit more worn out looking brown feathers. And so sometimes we can see on birds that there's been a change in their feathers and the difference in quality. And if you've spent any time at a banding station, this is probably something that you are seeing a lot. And so I didn't mention that feathers are keratin structures like our hair. And so, of course, when they get damaged from UV rays and flying through vegetation, et cetera, they can't regenerate themselves. So they have to be shed and completely replaced in order to maintain the bird's feather function. So when we're thinking about that diagram again of when molt is happening, if you're familiar with the technical terms, you might know about the pre-basic molt. This is referring to birds' basic plumage or non-breeding plumage. I'm going to keep this sort of as free of technical terms as I can. So I'm going to call this the post-breeding molt. So you know this molt is happening after the breeding season. In a lot of species, it's happening on the breeding grounds, but there are some exceptions to that, of course. But in these species that we're looking at today, it's happening post-breeding on the breeding grounds before they migrate south. So for adults, during this molt, birds are typically replacing all of their feathers, their body feathers, their head feathers, and their flight feathers, those long feathers on the wing. This is a chestnut-sided warbler male, just to illustrate that he is actually, during this molt, he's changing his appearance. So he's in that fancy breeding plumage. He does this post-breeding molt, and then he's in this sort of more drab non-breeding plumage. And this wing on the right here, this is actually a yellow warbler wing, but just to show you sort of what that molt can look like on the wing while the new feathers are growing in. But not all post-breeding molt leads to a change in appearance. When we look at our American redstart, this is an adult male, and his breeding plumage actually looks the same, pretty much the same as his non-breeding plumage. So in some species, we're not seeing a change in appearance, but he's still doing this molt. He is still replacing all of his head and body feathers, but they're just coming in the exact same color as they were before. And then, yeah, just to show again in our female American redstart, her breeding plumage, it's looking the same as her non-breeding plumage. But we have a special case in this species, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, in our young male. So this is the age, this is a first, I'll call him a first year bird. He hatched in the summer, and at the end of his first summer, he starts doing his molt. But in that first year, he's gonna look like a female, essentially, and probably a lot of you have seen this before. These young males, they look like females, and they keep this female looking plumage until their second year. We call this delayed plumage maturation. So he won't actually look like this, like the adult male, until he gets through his first full calendar year. So he's going to go into his first breeding season looking like this, looking like a female. And it's not until after that first breeding season, first calendar year, that he'll change into this adult plumage. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, in some species, they'll do a second molt every year. And you might know that as the pre-alternate molt, or we can think of it as the pre-breeding molt. This is a second molt in the annual cycle that happens before the breeding season, usually on the overwintering grounds before they migrate north to come back to Canada. And so in this black and white warbler, in the winter for this male, he's not quite looking like he does usually when we're used to seeing him in the spring and summer. His non-breeding plumage, he doesn't have that nice black throat. He doesn't have that nice full black cheek patch. He's looking a little bit more drab in the winter in his non-breeding plumage. And then before he comes back to join us in Canada, he's doing that pre-breeding molt. And because of that molt, he's going to look like this fancy breeding plumage. And this is a male in the middle of that molt. And so in this molt, the pre-breeding molt, birds are typically not replacing their wing feathers, their flight feathers. Usually it's just the body and head feathers, and not all of them, just some of them. And we really just don't know a lot about this molt in general. We know less about why this molt evolved. What is the purpose of it? Is it mainly contributing to feather function? Is it mainly contributing to these birds, change of appearance in the breeding season? We don't really have a good sense of this yet. There's a lot more to know. And we'll see in the same species in females, she's doing the same pre-breeding molt, but we're not seeing a change in plumage for her. So her non-breeding plumage in winter, it looks the exact same as her breeding plumage, but she is still molting during that time. And so if she's not changing her appearance, why is she doing this molt? We're not really sure yet, but I'm getting a little closer to that through this research. So we'll talk about that at the end. So coming back to our annual cycle, post-breeding molt happening on the on the breeding grounds, pre-breeding molt happening on the overwintering grounds before migration. And so in this research, I'm looking at this particular molt, the pre-breeding molt, and this part of the annual cycle when birds are in Jamaica, and then they're starting to head back up to Canada on their migration. And now why this is important, when we think about those population declines in a lot of these species, in order to understand what's driving those population declines, we really need to have a good sense of, what's happening in each part of the year, because they have to balance these events that require a lot of energy, breeding, migration, and molt, and they're happening in different geographic locations. And so for a long time, it's becoming easier now with the tracking technology that we have. But before that, it was hard to know, what's actually happening in these birds' lives when they're going to these different places. And how are these events contributing or harming birds' success? And so we need to get a good understanding of molt, which we don't quite have yet, in order to better understand these birds' population declines. And so this is something that we know. This is a phenomenon called carryover effects. So we know that the conditions that birds experience during one season, such as winter, can carry over to influence birds' success in subsequent seasons. So that just means that, if a bird overwinters in a poor quality habitat in a place like Jamaica, they tend to have poor body condition because they can't find as much food as, birds in better habitats. And because of that, they struggle more with their migratory fattening. So it might take them longer to get into a good enough condition to migrate. And so if birds are in a poor quality habitat, they might be delayed in starting their northward migration, and then they might be delayed in arriving to their breeding grounds. Because of that, they might miss out on finding a good breeding territory or finding a good mate for the breeding season. And generally they have poor reproductive success, or they might miss out on breeding altogether. So having a good quality habitat in the winter is really important, and it just doesn't just affect birds' success in winter, it affects their success during migration and during the breeding season. But this is quite complicated to get this picture for birds, especially before we had good tracking technology. And now it's becoming easier, and we are seeing a lot more study in this area. So I'll just show you a couple of examples For Kirtland's warblers that spend their non-breeding season or winter in the Bahamas, we know that their winter habitat quality is affecting the dates that they arrive back in the US. So better quality habitat birds are migrating earlier and arriving earlier, or as we think of it, on time when they get to their breeding grounds. And then another species that has been studied quite a bit compared to other warblers and songbirds is the American redstart. And again, we know that their winter habitat quality is influencing the quality of their plumage, and that has consequences for their communication. So if they have nicer looking plumage, that's going to help them more during the breeding season. And so birds from better habitat quality have nicer plumage. They arrive on the breeding grounds and they might have more breeding success because they're more attractive to the females that they're looking to mate with. Okay, and then when we think back to our pre-breeding molt, we don't understand those carryover effects as well. There really hasn't been much study into them. So we don't have, we really don't know, you know, how does that molt fit in? If birds are in poor quality habitats, is that affecting their molt? We have reason to think it probably is because birds need energy resources to molt. But if their molt is affected, if say they're having to molt later because of a poor quality habitat, is that then causing them to migrate later? And this is a piece of that puzzle that we really don't know yet, and something that hasn't received much study. But there are a couple examples of looking at that molt that indicate that this is probably something important. And so some people that I've been working with in BC, they did a study on Bolex orioles, and those birds are molting at a stopover ground in Mexico. And they did find that the quality of habitat of their molting ground was influencing their feather color. And so their plumage color, and that's the plumage that they're taking to the breeding season. So we, at least for Bolex oriole, we know that pre-breeding molt, where they're doing it, that has important consequences for how they're looking and how they're coming out of that molt, and then likely affects their breeding success. So again, we really know relatively little about, sorry, I forgot to change my term here, but pre-breeding molts, especially compared with the other molts. So this is an example of a diagram from the Birds of the World database, where we have a lot of information compiled for all species. And when we look at this diagram, we see, okay, that post-breeding molt, we know about that. We know when it's happening. But when we look at the pre-breeding molt for the northern water thrush, there's a lot of question marks here. We still just know very little about when it's even happening, if it's happening, you know, which feathers are birds molting? Are they molting all their feathers? We don't know. And so this is sort of the first step in understanding how the molt relates to the rest of the year, is first finding out when are these birds molting and how many feathers are they molting? So that takes me to what I'm trying to find out. And this is sort of a bit of a complicated looking diagram, but just to illustrate the direction of the relationships that we talked about. So again, we know that winter habitat quality is influencing birds' body condition. They're going to be in better condition in a better habitat. And then we want to know, how do those two things affect molt? Is that having an influence on the timing of birds' molt and the extent of feathers that they can molt? So that's my first question. And then from there, if birds are molting later, or if they're having to molt less feathers because they don't have enough energy, is that going to change their migration timing? And I'm measuring that by looking at the dates that these birds depart from Jamaica. So those are the two main questions that I'm trying to answer. And that's primarily for these three species: American redstart, black and white warbler, and northern water thrush. So the study site for this work is in a nature preserve, Fonthill Nature Preserve. It's on the southwest coast of Jamaica. And for those of you that are familiar with Jamaica or have been, Kingston is over here on the southeast. Oops. And I was over here on the southwest. So this is right on the coast. The two main habitats that are here, this is a lowland area. And so we have this old growth mangrove forest that's very wet. And we also have a second growth scrub forest that's quite dry. And these two habitats exist right beside each other. So birds can be crossing over between the two or using primarily one habitat. So that mangrove forest looks something like this. Typically throughout the winter, the time that the birds are there, there's standing water. It's a brackish system, so it is influenced a little bit by tides in the estuary. But in some areas, it's also just very influenced by rainfall, and it will hold rainfall through the season. So typically we see, you know, maybe up to 3 meters of standing water in a lot of areas. So staying wet through the season, and with that wet habitat, we know that these habitats are really abundant for insect populations and insects that birds are eating. So this tends to be a very high quality habitat for the warblers, and we know this. And I have a little video actually. And this is also a really important habitat for crocodiles, which I am not studying, but I did get to see them a lot while I was working in this system, which was pretty cool. I should have put a picture in. I'll have to do that for the next one. So sometimes this habitat can be really dry, and this is a drought period. I was there in 2023 from beginning of January to end of April, and this was a big drought year. And so for a lot of the season, actually, a lot of that water dried up, and this mangrove is completely dry in areas, which of course is likely to have consequences for insects and birds' food. And we are seeing a trend towards drying in the Caribbean with global climate change. So this might be something that we see more and more as we go on, which is going to have consequences for these birds. So then we'll compare that with the scrub forest. So this is pretty dry. Typically there's no standing water throughout the season. It's not a closed canopy. Trees are dropping leaves, so it can be quite open. It's easier to find birds in this habitat because the trees are lower and there's more open canopy, but it's quite a different habitat. And this tends to be lower quality for birds because there are less insects that these birds are eating. So we captured birds with mist netting. Some of you might have seen this before or be familiar with it. We mist netted in both the mangrove and the scrub. We wanted to capture all 3 species in both habitats. Some birds hold really small territories, so they might only be in the mangrove or they might only be in the scrub. And then we also have some birds that are kind of moving more between the two and using both habitats. And then we banded each of those birds, so they have a band with a unique number so that we can identify that bird. And part of my goal of this study was to actually capture the same bird multiple times throughout the season so that I could see what condition that bird was in and how its molt was progressing throughout the season. So banding was very helpful for that. And then we took biometric measurements so we could get a sense of what kind of condition that bird was in, how good their body condition was. So we measured structural size, things like wing length and tail length, the length of the tarsus, so the bird's part of the bird's leg. And we weighed them. And then we took a few other measurements. We looked at their breast muscle size. So typically a bird in better condition is going to have sort of a bigger, bulkier breast. And so by blowing on the feathers, we could see the shape of the breast and take a score for that. And we also used this interesting 3D printed device where we could actually measure the size of birds' breast muscle and get a numeric measurement to compare birds and their body condition. And then I looked at their molt. So this was very detailed process. I divided the bird's body up into a number of different patches and took a close look at each part of the bird and assigned each part of the bird a visual score. So when feathers are in active molt, they're emerging from these little sheaths, so we can actually see these feathers are in molt and get a sense of how much of the bird's body is actually in molt when I caught that bird. So this is the head of a prairie warbler on the left here. And then this is the back of an American redstart. And this bird has pretty heavy molt all along the back. And then these are the upper tail coverts, feathers that are right above the tail. And this is a time that birds are looking very unphotogenic when they're molting. So this involved me blowing on the bird, trying not to get dizzy, blowing all over this bird. But this process, it's actually quite fast. It really only takes up to a minute and not longer. So we're not having to keep these birds for too long to collect this information. It's a pretty quick addition to collecting the regular banding data. And for some birds, I also sampled their blood for stable isotopes. So what this means is that, so we have isotopes in the environment that come from the atmosphere, carbon, nitrogen, and hydrogen. And different habitat types will have a different signature based on the plants and how they're photosynthesizing. So in Jamaica, in the wet mangrove versus the dry scrub, they're going to have a different isotope signature. And that's going to show up in the tissues of insects that are eating those plants. And then that will show up in the tissues of birds that are eating those insects. So when we look at the bird's blood sample, we get this numerical value for carbon isotope. And we can basically tell, which habitat was that bird spending most of its time? Was it in a wet forest with a low number, or was it in a dry forest with a high number? And that just helps us to better understand, was this bird spending most of its season in a poor quality habitat or a high quality habitat? And so we had that scale of numbers from wet to dry. And then for some birds, we put Motus tags on them. I think I've heard that there's quite a lot of Motus towers in Nova Scotia. We'll look at some of the locations of those. I imagine a lot of you have heard about those quite a bit, but if you haven't, we have these little radio telemetry tags that are very tiny. They weigh less than 4% of the bird's body. So for a warbler, these tags weigh, less than 0.3 grams. They're really light. And they have this little elastic harness that sits on the bird's hips. And this is a tag that the bird will only wear for, not longer than a year. We're collecting data for about 2 months, but the elastic will just degrade and break down from the sun and from wearing it. And so that tag will eventually just fall off. And usually that will happen within a year. So the bird's not going to wear this for its entire life. And once the tag is on the bird, it's actually quite hard to see. The feathers kind of sit over it. You'll see the back of the water thrush here. And we can see the antenna, but we can't really see the tag. So here's a map of all the Motus towers. You can see on the East Coast here, there's a ton of towers. You've got a ton of towers in Nova Scotia and all along this East Coast. So we're really set up to have that data automatically recorded from Jamaica down here as birds are migrating up the East Coast. And so I'll remind you again, we're near White House, we have a tower, and then there's only one other tower in Jamaica near Kingston. So I'll tell you about some results. We found that most species began molting in mid-February, the water thrushes being an exception. They started molting at the end of January. Our black and white warblers and American redstarts molting in mid-February, and that's actually a couple of weeks earlier than we sort of know them to molt. So that might be because of something that happened that year, because of the climate. We'll have a better idea from getting multiple years of data. But so far in this study population, they're molting a little earlier than we know them to molt. We were able to get some bonus data on extra species that we catch a lot. So Northern Parula, prairie warbler, they were molting in mid-February as well. And once they started molting, we kept seeing molting birds right up until they were migrating into April. And then we actually found the ovenbirds, wrong way. Ovenbirds were molting as well, and this is a species that is not really known to do this pre-breeding molt, or there's just more uncertainty on, if they are. We had some individuals in the population molting, so it seems like some ovenbirds are doing that molt, but not all of them. But that wasn't happening until March. And then I'll show you this figure just to give you a sense of, how many birds in the population are molting. So this is around February 12th, and we're going over time throughout the season here. And we've got the proportion of birds in our population that were molting. So when we get up here, all of the birds are molting in that population. So that's really like the peak of molt that's happening in these species. And we see that happening for our redstarts and our black and white warblers around the end of February. And once we start seeing birds molting, most of those birds that we're capturing are continuing to molt right through to the end of the season. So they seem to be molting right up until when they migrate. But that varies a little bit in the other species we captured. And then just to highlight for the ovenbirds here, not all of the birds in the population are molting, less than half or getting closer to all captured birds, but definitely not all of those individuals are going to molt. And we don't know why. That's a question that I can't answer. And then I'll just show you here that molt tended to happen more frequently on the head feathers rather than the body feathers. So we have head feathers in orange and body feathers in blue. And for most of those species, we're seeing these orange bars are higher. More birds are molting feathers on their heads than they are on their bodies. And that might be because head feathers are contributing more to that plumage signaling in the breeding season. But it might also be because when birds are perching and they're upright, their head feathers are receiving more sun and UV damage to feathers than some of their body feathers. So that's, again, something I can't answer, but that's a bit of speculation related to some of the work that's been done. But molting head feathers seems to be more important for more birds than molting body feathers. And these are just a couple of pictures that illustrate that. So when we look at this prairie warbler's head, that's a lot of molt there. Almost all of the feathers on its head are molting at one time. And on this parula, we sort of look at the face here, and most of the face is molting there. But we did see molt on the bodies as well. This is the back of a black and white warbler. And at the time we caught this bird, it's molting almost all of the feathers on its back. But that varies. This water thrush here is only molting a few feathers on its back, so it's not replacing all of them. And then this redstart again, only about 5 feathers molting on its breast, not all of them. So it's definitely some variation in how much birds are molting. So in thinking about that first question I had, did body condition influence molt? And the answer is for black and white warblers, yes, it did, which is kind of what I was expecting, but I didn't see this in all the species. But in black and white warblers, birds that were in better condition, likely from a better habitat, did a more intense molt. So they molted more feathers at one time. And we see that relationship was actually stronger for subadult birds. And what I mean by that is it's these birds' first winter. It's their first time doing this molt. It's their first winter. And those birds, if they were in better body condition, they molted even more intensely than the adult birds. And this might be because those birds are arriving to Jamaica with relatively poorer quality feathers compared with the adults. And so it might just benefit them more. If they're in good enough condition to do more molt, it might benefit them more to sort of up their plumage freshness and have better quality feathers before they migrate back home for the breeding season. And this was the same in both sexes, so which is interesting because the males are actually changing their appearance and the females are not changing their appearance, but it didn't matter, males or females, if they were in better condition, they were molting more. And then in redstarts, we didn't find body condition influence their molt, but we did find that age did. So in those first winter birds, the subadult birds, they did a more intense molt as well. And this is a first winter male. And what's interesting is that he has molted in some new feathers that are black, the color of the adults, but not all of his new feathers are black. Some of them are gray. So this really makes us wonder, you know, if he's molting those feathers, why doesn't he just start changing into his black adult feathers? We're not sure, but I think that points more to this molt being related to feather function. And, you know, for whatever reason, some of his new feathers are black and some are gray. But if this molt isn't completely contributing to his adult plumage, it might just be more driven by needing to maintain his feathers for their function. So reminding you again, this is what he'll look like eventually. And then we'll get into kind of the exciting stuff and kind of nearing the end of this here. So the tracking results, and I haven't answered the second question. I'm still working on that. I don't know yet if molt influence the timing of migration, but I am starting to determine those departure dates from Jamaica. And so these are my 3 species, a subset of those birds, and this is where they went. So it is pretty incredible that, you know, these birds are in a single forest in Jamaica, and then they're going on to migrate through and breed really all across the eastern half of the continent. You can see even within one species, they're not all going to the same place. So it just really highlights the importance of understanding their winter habitats, because it's going to have, you know, a single forest in Jamaica. It's having consequences for bird populations that are breeding across half of our continent. And you can see here in blue, the black and white warblers, we had a lot of them coming up this east coast here, and quite a few of them landing in Nova Scotia. So this is one track for a first winter female. It's her first migration. We detected her in Jamaica on April 5th, but that's probably not when she left. It looks like with this technology, like we can still miss things. And so we still missed her departure from Jamaica. She probably stayed there until late April or early May, but we have her in Florida on May 14th. And then 5 days later, she makes it all the way to Pennsylvania, and she stayed there for several days. So that seems like an important stopover site for her. She stayed there to refuel. And then the next day she's in Maine. And a couple of days later, she's in New Brunswick and then Nova Scotia. So it seems like she kind of came up this way, went into New Brunswick, and then crossed over to Nova Scotia. And this might not be her final breeding destination. I'll be able to tell a little bit more when I look at the actual signal from the telemetry data, but this is where the tracks end. So it's likely that she was breeding, you know, maybe not right here, but somewhere in this area, probably somewhere in Nova Scotia. So I'll just zoom in on the end of her track there. And I was telling Tony before, this is Minus Bay, right? And she was recorded around here. And then let's see how much time we have. Make sure I don't take up too much time. I will kind of wrap this up, and then I might show you one more track on the Motus website. So the overall goal of this research is first to understand how does this pre-breeding molt fit into the rest of the annual cycle, and is it affecting birds' migration timing? And if it is, that might be affecting their breeding success. So we're trying to figure out if this pre-breeding molt is limiting bird populations in the year. And if it is limiting bird populations, then it might direct us to focusing more conservation effort on their winter habitats versus other habitats in the year. It might be more important to focus efforts there. So that's sort of the overall goal. And I'm not quite there at the end yet, but that's what I'm working on now through the summer. And this is going to be really important, especially in the context of global climate change, because we are seeing more and more years with drought in Jamaica in these habitats that birds are using. And that's, of course, going to have consequences for bird survival. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm just going to show you a couple more interesting tracks quickly on the Motus website, just so you can see the locations in your region where these birds went. There we go. Okay, so these are all black and white warblers. The black and white warblers were the only of my species that came out your way, but I got a couple different birds coming around crossing the Minas Basin here around East Walton. I've never been to Nova Scotia. Maybe some of you are familiar with these locations. One near the Economy River Wilderness area. And then we've got one coming all the way down over here on Big Island. That's a few different birds. And then I had a couple more that ended up down here. So another one crossing over around Wolfville and then ending up all the way over here on the west at Big Island as well. So a couple birds from the same winter population ended up on Big Island. And this project has been going on since the late 80s, I believe, and they've just started using Motus more. And last year, I guess the 2022 year, they also had a few black and white warblers ending up in Nova Scotia and a lot on the northeast coast of the US, like around Maine and New Hampshire. And there are probably birds that are stopping there and breeding there. Yeah, but that's pretty exciting to actually be able to see where these birds are going. And I'll leave it there for questions.
Wow. Thank you very much. What questions have folks got, please? Speak, raise your hand, put it in the chat box, whatever you wish.
Julie Smith here.
Yep.
Really, really interesting. And I understand this is all preliminary data, but it's fascinating to me. I never knew that birds molted every single feather. This is...
Yeah. And so not all birds will every year, but in songbirds, typically they will molt every single feather at least once a year. And the molt of every single feather, that's usually happening, that post-breeding molt after the breeding season. And then they'll molt those feathers, some of those feathers a second time. And that's quite common in songbirds, not just warblers, but some other species like the orioles and the grosbeaks and yeah, the few different bird groups will do that second pre-breeding molt as well.
That's so much effort. I mean,
yes,
it's such an intense effort, especially So, and their beaks change as well. The bills change. And is that the
sometimes?
Same? Yeah, sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah. Like in say like yellow warblers, for example, the color of their beaks will change. I don't know a lot about that. I'm not sure how energy intensive that process is, but yeah.
And again, fascinating that birds that started out in the same spot in Jamaica wound up on the same small island. It's a great island, a great beach area up outside Antigonish there. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It's pretty incredible, and
they're so fixated on those areas. Like they really are so site specific. It's amazing.
Yeah, and they're site specific in the winter too. I didn't mention this, but we do have from this project, there are birds that will go like back to the exact same 50 meter by 50 meter forest area in Jamaica, and they're coming there year after year and being caught there multiple years in a row. So their site fidelity in the winter is also pretty incredible.
After traveling across the globe, there's so much we don't know. Thank you so much.
Yes, Ken has a question.
Yes, I'm unmuted now.
Yes, you are, Ken.
Okay, those two birds that ended up in Big Island, which is one of my birding spots, is it possible that they may have been moving on further than that, and that there just wasn't a Motus tower further beyond? I know where that Motus tower is.
It is possible. The Motus tags are a little bit more limited in that the battery doesn't last forever. So it's possible that for some of these tracks, the battery died and so the tracks were cut off, or also just that the bird continued on to another area where there wasn't a tower. So I'm not getting final breeding destinations. What's most important for this answering my question about molt is just to get the precise departure date from Jamaica, and then the rest is kind of bonus information, but still a lot of information that we don't have about different populations. You know, where are they actually going?
I understand. That was really neat to see that they both landed in the same area. Yeah,
definitely. And I think I should have emphasized this in my presentation, but it's interesting. You know, I'm trying to answer a couple of questions that seem, kind of simple, but I'm ending up with a lot more questions than I started with. And this presentation is sort of a walking you through this process, but also telling you a lot about what I don't know, really. I know a lot less than what I don't know.
We've got a quick question in the chat, Shay, from Natalie. How do you choose?
Yeah.
How do you choose the 3 species you studied?
Yeah, that's a great question. Mostly driven by what species are most reliably captured at this site. So this site was already very well set up for a study, and those 3 species are really abundant. There's lots of them, and it's easier to catch them multiple times throughout the season, which was my goal. I actually set out to try to put Motus tags on prairie warblers and parullas because I wanted to get sort of a bird from each level of the canopy, just to get a little bit more of a comparison in the habitats that they're using. But those birds that spend more time in the canopy are so much harder to find and so much harder to catch again. So we really weren't recapturing prairie warblers or parullas, and that would have made it really hard to get good information about their molt progression. And so I decided not to put the tags on. The prairie warblers, the females, are also really small, and even though we had the smallest sort of bird tag possible, some of them just don't weigh enough to put the tag on, and so it was just easier to go with the water thrushes instead, which are really abundant, and they're not using the scrub habitat as much, so we're not getting as much of like a habitat quality comparison. But yeah, mostly just driven by what I could catch and what I could recatch, essentially.
Okay, thanks. I did see your
for
hand
the
was up
question.
for and I can't pronounce your name right. I'm sorry.
Ray would be perfectly fine.
Okay, thanks.
Yes. So I have a quick question. So considering that, well, like the birds some of the birds like would molt, so I wonder what would happen for the feathers that they shredded. So do they try to recycle those somehow, or does it simply just drop in the field?
But yeah, yes, unfortunately, yes, the Motus tag, like in some cases, researchers can find them and take them out of the environment if we have if they're still emitting a signal and you know where they are and you can go look. But unfortunately, for a lot of them, we won't recover that tag, and it is just lost to the environment, which is the downside. But for getting this information, it is a big advantage to use the Motus tags rather than, say, the satellite tags. The satellite tags have, more battery power, so we can track birds for a full year, but you have to get that tag back from the bird. And that is so hard with these warblers. Like, you imagine, so many of them don't make it through their next migration. They might die between one year to the next because they don't have a long life. Or they'll, they might go to a different area, or even if they are in that area in the right forest, we still might not catch them because we might not be able to find them, or we might just, even once we find them, it's still hard to catch them. So it's just so hard to get that data. And so the Motus is a huge advantage in that a lot of this is recorded automatically. And it is, unfortunately, just a weighing of the benefits, right? Some of those tags are being lost in the environment, but we are getting a lot of good data that, it would be really hard to get this data otherwise.
Oh, thank
Great
you for
question.
these insights. And I have another curiosity. So basically, I think most of these birds are driven by the natural instinct to migrate and to breed, but this can also be energy intensive and high risk. So I heard that, for example, for salmons, so there are individuals who, due to mutation or injuries, lose their reproductive habit, but then they become much more long-lived and grow to a tremendous size. And I wonder if similar occurrences might happen to birds that usually would just molt and breed, but somehow individuals
Right.
choose not to?
That's a great question. I really have no idea. I can't answer it. I don't know. It sounds reasonable that that's something that could happen, but yeah, I don't know. Yeah, but definitely some birds do miss out on breeding in a particular year, and they are to some extent might be having to make some decisions on how much to molt versus how much not to molt. If they don't have enough energy, they might not be able to molt. So there definitely might be a lot of it just driven by hormones and instinct, as you say, but in some cases they might not be able to if they don't have enough energy. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the insight, Biology Turner. It's truly a very exciting field, and just feel like there's still so much more research to be done, to be discovered.
There sure is.
You sort of answered my question of why you use the Motus tags more than the satellite tags.
Yeah. Yeah, just the a sense of being able to get more data from more birds. There are some interesting geolocator tag, like the satellite tag projects for warblers, and actually some of the project partners from Georgetown in Washington, they are actually doing a satellite tag project on redstarts, and it'll be interesting to see what they get because they tag birds in Jamaica, Mexico, Colombia, Newfoundland, Minnesota, like all across their range, and they're trying to find out how connected those breeding populations are or not connected. Like, how many birds breeding in the same place are actually going to spend their winter in the same place. So yeah, that's something that people are looking into. It'll be really interesting to see what they come up with. And same study population that I was working on.
So much data and strides forward in technology. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Cool. Do we have any other questions at all, folks?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to talk to you all who are actually living in places where these birds are going. So it's pretty exciting for me.
Really appreciate this evening or afternoon for you. Thank you very much for the talk.
Yeah.
Excellent. And we're all waiting for the warblers to come back. Like I said earlier, we're getting wacky waiting. We just need some birds, so it won't be long. So thank you very much again, Shay, and to everybody for coming. Oh, it's a clapping hand from Laurie and Shay. Kyle, yes, it is. Sorry.
Thank you.
All these emojis for simple computer guys like me.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, everybody. Keep your eyes on the Facebook page and website for details of the out of town meeting. And thank you all again. I look forward to seeing everybody in the field soon.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a great spring.
Thank you very much. Have a good one, everyone. Good night.